Good morning and welcome. My name is Shuvaloy Majumdar. I'm the Foreign Policy Program Director and Monk Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Canada. We're really excited to host a panel today to discuss the so-called elections in Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, a brutal theocratic regime characterized by routine violations of human rights and international law, unparalleled state sponsorship of terrorism, and the perpetual abuse of its own people, is back in the news. The Biden administration is considering returning to the Iran nuclear deal, ostensibly to prevent the regime from acquiring nuclear weapons and to secure some form of peace in the region. However, over the short life of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, Iran continued its belligerent activities such as cyber attacks, engaged in further repression of its own people, and propped up similarly oppressive actors, including the Syrian regime and Hamas. Its continued development of long-range missile systems designed to potentially deliver the nuclear warheads that the JCPOA aims to prevent from being developed suggests that the nuclear deal failed to tackle what the principal issue is. The regime in Iran itself poses an intractable threat to the peace and stability of the region and the best interests of Iranians themselves. To chart a new course requires a discussion on a peaceful transition away from the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime to a democratic system, which Iranians within the country and throughout the international diaspora have been calling for. Any solution to the challenges caused by Tehran must first start with how we can empower the democratic voices within Iran and beyond. So set just before these so-called elections in Iran, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is hosting today an incredible discussion about recent efforts by dissidents and Iranian society at large to articulate unified demands for the peaceful transition to democracy. Our incredible panel will discuss the path forward and whether a return to a dovish approach to Iran, as the Biden administration allegedly appears to prefer, is actually in the best interest of the Iranian people. So to kick off the conversation, I'm extremely excited to invite my friend and colleague, Ali Reza Nader at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD, to initiate a discussion. Actually, no, let me take that back. I'm going to start this conversation with my colleague and friend at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Maryam Memorsadeghi, to give us a description as to what is actually happening in Iranian elections. What is the process involved? Are they real? Are they not real? Do they enfranchise people to any degree or do they not? So for the uninitiated, Maryam, I pass the floor over to you, an incredibly accomplished human rights advocate and our newest senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Maryam Memorsadeghi.
Thank you so much, Shuv. It's an honor to be at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I'm looking forward to this discussion with my fellow panelists, and I'm looking forward to more discussions like these at MLI, focused in particular on the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people and transition in Iran to democracy. I think most people in the West now understand, because Iran is such a repressive regime, that its elections are a sham meant to provide a veneer of legitimacy and credibility to what is really a system of brutality. The Supreme Leader Khamenei and the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif have said in Persian language and in English language, respectively, that elections are what proves to the world that the Iranian people buy into the system. And so it's no surprise that over the years, Iranians have tried to boycott elections as part of their larger movement for democratic change. This time, that boycott tactic is the broadest and most powerful it has ever been. The No to Voting campaign is part of the larger campaign of No to the Islamic Republic. And it has gathered steam throughout the country, and it has gathered steam throughout the world among the diaspora. It's not a hard sell. People know it in their bones. It's an instinctive sense that these elections are an insult to them, that they're being used. And the fact that Khamenei has chosen what is most likely Raisi to be the next president and most likely to be the next supreme leader adds to the insult, because when Iranians came out onto the streets over the last 2-3 years, their protests spanned over 200 cities. And in one set of protests resulted in the Iran massacre of Alban, at least 1,500 people killed on the streets. The slogans that they used included the slogan about reformists and hardliners, both, your time is up, and a lot of resentment and fury directed against reformists. So in a way, it's no surprise that Khamenei has responded by not really offering that lie of reformists versus moderates this time, and just going straight for, yes, I'm putting in somebody who is really even worse than I am and has no bones about killing people, is dutiful about killing. So let me just say a bit about the elections, broad brush, to give time for others to speak about their particular takes on it. Elections are usually dismissed because of the vetting process. So foreign media, analysts typically talk about how they're not free and fair because candidates are vetted by the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council is very tightly controlled by the Supreme Leader himself. And so basically the people who are allowed to run are those that the Supreme Leader wants to run. But this is really only one part of why elections are such a farce in Iran. And if it was any other country, all the other reasons why the elections are unfree and unfair would be spoken about more. So what are those other reasons that elections are so much a sham? Well, for one thing, the government itself, the regime itself, controls the election process. So in a democratic country, election bodies are independent. In Iran, the regime itself conducts the elections, does not allow any free media reporting on elections, doesn't allow any observation of elections, and intimidates people into voting in elections. And perhaps most importantly, though, the thing that denies Iranians popular sovereignty, representation in government, is that once this president is quote unquote elected, he doesn't have any power. And the supreme leader is the person who makes all the important decisions about domestic policy, international policy. And again, the Iranian people have known and experienced that well. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. You're muted, Shuv.
You've described a regime that has been in power for a great period of time, a generation at least of Iranians' lives. And so thank you for taking some time to provide us a sense through your excellent intervention on what the process has looked like. Let me ask you quickly before I let you go, while there is an Iranian election underway, there's also a lot of discussion about where the seat of power might be in Iran, which is with the supreme leader. Is there any discussion about the selection of that successor?
Yes, this person who is most likely going to be president, Ebrahim Raisi, is most likely going to be the successor to the current supreme leader. One of the important things to consider is that in the West, there has been some talk about the Revolutionary Guard Corps being a counterweight to the supreme leader. Well, now that Khamenei has indicated that Raisi will be his successor, it's important to note that the IRGC is also behind this person, even though he's a cleric. As people like myself have argued all along, there is no real significant divide between the IRGC and the office of the supreme leader. With this selection of Raisi as the next president and likely next supreme leader, there is a consolidation and sort of a correction, a preemptive correction on any kind of split between the IRGC and the Supreme Leader's office.
Okay, thank you. What a great point to spring to Ali Reza Nader at the FDD, who writes prolifically on how the IRGC and regime leadership affects attitudes around the world, including in Iran. So Ali Reza, let me turn to you now for a view on as we look at the candidates, the superficial masquerade campaign that we have seen, give us a survey as to who the key individuals are and why they matter. First with the election, but then, more widely, who are we thinking about when we think about the Iranian regime exactly?
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with such a great group of people on this panel. And I think you used the correct word to describe this so-called election or selection. I think circus is the right word. Right now, it looks like that this election is basically about putting Ebrahim Raisi into power so he can succeed Khamenei. Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the most powerful authority. I believe he's 82 years old. He has cancer, and he's going to pass away eventually. And he has been planning and talking about the succession to him. So I think the presidential election is really important in that regard because it'll determine who succeeds Khamenei. And Khamenei himself, before he became the supreme leader, was president of the Islamic Republic. And Raisi is somebody that Khamenei has really emphasized in terms of the type of person who wants to succeed him. He wants a new generation of what he considers to be a true revolutionary, a complete fundamentalist who really believes in the Islamic Republic and its ideology, regardless of how much it has really died among the Iranian people in the last 42 years. I would be surprised at this point if any of the other candidates besides Raisi become president. You have Saeed Jalili. He's the former national security advisor and nuclear negotiator. He's very much also a fundamentalist, a very dogmatic person. There is one other candidate that is described as quote unquote moderate. He's the former head of the central bank of Iran. But it goes to show you what even a moderate in Iran looks like. He has been sanctioned by the US for money laundering and terrorism financing. Other candidates like Ali Larijani, the former Speaker of Parliament, have been disqualified. And this goes to show you what a sham the process is, because Larijani, in terms of his devotion to the Islamic Republic, is very much qualified to serve the system. But there's very intense competition right now between the mafia-like factions within the regime for power. And I think the Larijani family are on the outs. And Raisi, who's backed by Khamenei, and his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is very much the preferred candidate. If he becomes president, it goes to show you what kind of strategy the regime will pursue, because Raisi's key qualification is that he's a very fearsome person. He's a murderer. He's responsible for a mass execution of Iranians in 1988. Other panelists will talk about this. But I really do believe his choice shows that the regime means to rule through fear and brutal violence. The regime, regardless of what happens with JCPOA, if the US re-enters the agreement, the regime knows that has very little legitimacy in Iran, and that it could face a popular revolt like it did in 2017 and 2019, as Mariam described. So I think this is a regime that's hanging on to power and knows it's vulnerable. And that's why we're going to see somebody like Raisi become president.
No, thank you for that. It's a really excellent survey you've provided. But before I let you go, let me ask you this. Didn't we just encounter moderates from the regime from the last several years? Wasn't Rouhani and his team supposed to be the fresher, more modern update that the West was trying to bolster in power in Iran so that they might be able to build a constituency for a more responsible Iran. What happened to them?
So the West, as you said, did create this image of moderation under President Rouhani. He was supposed to be the moderate, and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif, was also supposed to be a more moderate figure. And if we look at their track record, we see actually that there has been no moderation from Iran. Never mind in terms of its foreign policy and national security, but the last 8 years under Rouhani have been some of the most violent years in Iran. The November 2019 massacre of at least 1,500 Iranians. I think the number is actually much higher, frankly, but we could talk about that. That happened under Rouhani. And I thought it was funny that CNN was framing the election of Raisi, and many other outlets and academics and analysts are framing it as the so-called hardliners coming to power in Iran. Whereas if you look at Iran in the last 8 years, the same people have been essentially in power. Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards, people like Raisi. Rouhani had very little authority. He really achieved nothing, and he's very deeply unpopular in Iran. And this, with him, I think this facade of moderation will forever die. I think if anybody outside of Iran takes this concept seriously, I would question their motivations, because there's really very little evidence, and we can't really find any factual evidence that these so-called moderates are capable of achieving anything. It's just really a talking point by this time. And I think that the death of so-called moderation in Iran is a really critical juncture for the regime, because it can't fool Iranians, and increasingly can't fool people outside of Iran. Look, if Raisi becomes president, this guy is implicated in mass executions. I mean, he's a true criminal. And so who's going to make this argument that we should engage with the Islamic Republic and offer it so-called carrots to get it to do what we want it to do? You can't negotiate with these people. You can't engage with them. The West couldn't do it with Rouhani. It's highly unlikely that it will do it with Raisi in power.
Thank you for that, Alireza. Wonderful, wonderful intervention. And I think it's actually perfect at this point to turn to our MLI senior fellow, Kaveh Shahrouz, who was an incredible proponent for Canadians to understand the implications of what 1988 and this particular character, Raisi, was behind. So Kaveh, why don't you give us a picture as to what happened in 1988? What were the crimes of this person who is now, as we've heard from Miriam and from Alireza, not just the next president of Iran, but also the very likely designated successor of the supreme leader?
Shuv, thank you so much. And thanks so much to my MLI colleagues for putting on such a great and timely event. So I will certainly talk about Raisi in 1988 because I think it's really important for the same reason that I think 1988 has generally been important. And it's why I've sort of made it one of the key issues that I focused on, because I think it really represents and distills down what the Islamic Republic is. There are, as Alireza mentioned and Mariam before him, there are very few officials. There are a lot of officials in the Islamic Republic that have blood on their hands, but there are very few that have as much blood on their hands as Ebrahim Raisi. And much of it goes back over 3 decades to 1988. So just for the uninitiated, let me just say what happened in 1988. The 1980s were a particularly brutal time under the Islamic Republic. It was the reign of terror. It was the time that the regime tried to execute many of its opponents from across the political spectrum. And in that process, it killed many, it tortured many, and it also had a lot of political prisoners that it had arrested right after the revolution and in the early part of the 80s. And it had subjected those people to kangaroo courts and had thrown them in prison. In the summer of 1988, shortly after the Iran-Iraq war ended, and an opposition group named the Mujahideen launched a failed incursion into Iran. The Iranian regime launched probably its most murderous act in its history, and it's a very murderous history. So this is really saying something. And the reasons for why it launched this are not entirely understood, but it came down from then Supreme Leader Ruhollah Khomeini. He issued a fatwa saying that basically every political prisoner in Iran's prisons had to be retried, and if they remained committed to their anti-regime positions, they would not be given any sort of clemency and they would be killed. And this task was left to a number of government officials from various ministries and agencies in the regime. And among them was a young man at the time, I think he was 28 or 29, named Ebrahim Raisi. He was the deputy prosecutor of Iran's revolutionary courts. Now, the revolutionary courts didn't deal with criminal matters, civil matters. They were they were focused on political crimes, and they still exist to this day. And Ebrahim Raisi's role as part of a group of people which came to be known among the prisoners as a death commission was to visit prisons and to hold hearings for prisoners that had already been sentenced and had already served part of their sentence. In some cases, these are prisoners that had already finished their sentences, but the regime was still keeping them in prison, just to give you a sense of the madness and cruelty of the Islamic regime. And basically, they would go from prison to prison, they would question people, and within about 2 minutes determine whether or not somebody would live or die. So first they began with prisoners associated with the Mujahideen. They would bring them and they would say, do you still subscribe to the ideology of Mujahideen? Do you still support the Mujahideen? And if the answer was yes, that was literally the end of the trial. They would be moved to a line on the left and they would go to hang. Once they were done with the Mujahideen, they began going through this process again with prisoners that had a leftist orientation, being Marxists or what have you. And the question was slightly different in that case. They would ask them, are you a Muslim? And if the answer was, no, I remain an atheist, they would go to hang. And if the answer was, well, maybe, yes, possibly, I'm willing to consider it, they would go and they would be subjected to further torture and imprisonment, but they wouldn't die. This horrendous crime was so awful that Khomeini's designated successor at the time, Ayatollah Montazeri, really couldn't take it anymore. And he spoke up. And as a result of him saying, history is going to judge us very unkindly as a result of this, he was set aside. He was placed under house arrest, where he remained until he died a few years ago. Again, sort of Ebrahim Raisi was at the center of this. He ordered the executions. And after the executions, the families of those victims were simply told to come and collect some belongings. They were not allowed to hold, ceremonies to remember the dead. They were not really told where bodies are buried. They still remain buried in mass graves that have not been fully explored. And, to this day, the government refuses to acknowledge this in any meaningful way that this massacre happened, and it continues to battle the families, not allowing them to even hold, little memorials for the killed. Ebrahim Raisi is not, as I said, he's very deeply implicated, but he is not the only one. He is not an aberration. I think his presence in the government structure and now his soon to be, I assume, announced presidency and maybe becoming supreme leader really speaks to what the Islamic Republic is. Other people that had been engaged in those killings have also managed to advance. So somebody like Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, for example, another cleric, served on those death commissions and later went on to become Minister of Interior and, ironically, Minister of Justice. Similarly, Ebrahim Raisi now heads up the judiciary, which is a very cruel joke, and was recently announced that 6 months ago, almost a year ago, as the person that would investigate Iran's role in shooting down the Ukrainian national flight PS-752. Another very, very cruel joke. I think the meaning of all this, the fact that his hands are so covered in blood, is that the Islamic Republic is one that has a culture of impunity. The more you murder, the more you kill in service of this regime, the more you advance. And the fact that there will be no accountability for your crimes. It indicates the utter indifference to human life. And I think the 1988 case also lays bare the fact that this divide between reformists and hardliners is not a real one, as my colleagues have alluded. Mir Hossein Mousavi, the now imprisoned or house imprisoned leader of the so-called Green Movement, was himself the prime minister at the time of these killings, and he didn't speak up. He took no actions. He is lauded as one of the leading reformers in Iran. So I think that should tell you that, they were all connected in this crime together. The challenge, I think, for the Islamic Republic will be twofold. One, I think it will now lose its talking point that there are, hardliners and reformists. I think the world has finally seen the mask slip, and they understand what the Islamic Republic is all about. Once Ibrahim Raisi becomes the president of the Islamic Republic, I don't think that lie will carry much weight anymore. But I think there will also be practical problems for the Islamic Republic. Its president will be well known as a man who committed crimes against humanity. I was very fortunate to have had a role, as you mentioned, Shuv, in convincing Canada's Parliament to recognize the killings in 1988 as constituting crimes against humanity. At the time, I remember some folks in the human rights movement saying to me, well, what's the point of this? This is just a symbolic motion. And I said, no, there will come a time when this will matter. And I think it matters now because, we can point to the fact that our parliament has actually said this man is implicated in crimes against humanity. If you try to normalize relationships with him, what does that say about our values? And I think we can make that argument across the West. And, I think it has managed to lay bare what we know about the Islamic Republic, and it will deprive, the lobbyists and defenders of the Islamic Republic of this lie that the Islamic Republic is somehow capable of change and moderation, because ultimately when the chips were down, this is where the Islamic Republic ended up. And, there's not much that could have been done about it. The only solution really is going to be people-led regime change. I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions afterwards.
It's a masterful summary of events 30 years ago that bear direct relevance today, because the same actors seem to be circulating back up to the top. They never left. There has been no accountability. Let me ask you this, Kaveh. What would your advice be, first, to Prime Minister Trudeau in the aftermath of these so-called elections? Imagine with me that you're in his office and he sought your counsel. What would be the most important thing you would want the Canadian Prime Minister to understand?
I have trouble imagining Prime Minister Trudeau seeking my counsel on any of these issues based on what we've seen. But if that unlikely scenario played out, I think what I would say is, look, I think our thinking on the Iran issue, both at the political level and among our sort of foreign policy experts, has been wrong, right? We've been thinking about Iran in terms of this politics of reformers, hardliners, how do we strengthen one or the other? That thinking, I think, is expired. We can't do that anymore. Really, our policy has to be, how do we empower Iranian people to get rid of this regime? I know regime change is kind of a dirty word, dirty phrase post-Iraq war, but I really think there is room for it, so long as it's not, done through weapons and armies. The Iranian people have themselves illustrated that they want change. It's our role to express our solidarity and to help them in whatever way we can, and that's going to involve our prime minister and leaders from across the free world speaking out, talking about what a farce this election was, talking about how much blood Raisi has on its hands, using legal mechanisms where possible to actually, commence prosecutions. There is a prosecution underway right now in Sweden, for example, against somebody implicated in 1988. That may need to expand to include other government officials, including Iran's president. There are legal challenges, but that's something that ought to be considered. And also just listening to Iranian dissidents and figuring out what they want and helping them overthrow this regime and get what they're rightly seeking, which is democracy, human rights, justice for past crimes.
Thank you so much, Kaveh. Excellent interventions. And so now, from the ugly nature of this regime and the context of the people that protest it regularly, surprisingly for a very long period of time, protests across Iran have sustained themselves, despite some of the logic of the early commentators of this. But too often, we separate the words and the deeds of the Iranian regime, and Kaveh, Alireza, Miriam have all presented a really good understanding as to what is actually happening inside Iran. But there's another dimension to the consequences of the leadership in Iran. It is their nuclear ambitions, their adventurism on state support of terrorism. So at this point, I'd love to turn to Besma Momani, who is one of Canada's greatest voices and analysts and thinkers of the wider Middle East region. She publishes prolifically. We don't always agree, but I do admire her views a great deal. And so, in the context of what we're hearing about the churn of politics in Iran, the test of succession, some of the actors that are involved, what will be the implications of this new leadership or the new face of this leadership in the wider Middle East region? What's your take?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's a really great question. And I agree with some of the things that have been said before, which really is that this is definitely going to be a hardliner coming in and really elbowing out any sort of potential quote unquote moderate voices. I mean, I think what you're going to get is really a doubling down of Iran's nefarious activities in the region. I think that's pretty much expected. Certainly, I think some of the stuff that we've heard recently, for example, with Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, saying that really, it really is the supreme leader that has, at the end of the day, the most foreign policy say, and certainly giving the same kind of credit to Soleimani, the one who was recently killed, and the IRGC points out the inner mechanisms of this regime, which is it's very much, I think, at least foreign policy is concerned, very much centralized. And the supreme leader, and certainly I think Raisi, what we're going to expect is more of the same nefarious activity. In fact, maybe even a doubling down. We had seen some potential hope for, I would say, some rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Certainly, I think Zarif was on, I think, something there to sort of at least mend a little bit of the fences. But I think we're going to see, just more intervention in Lebanese domestic affairs, which is really quite problematic. Of course, they support Hezbollah, which increasingly in the context of Lebanon's near, I think, failed state is going to be very, very problematic. Iraq is similarly teetering. It has enormous amount of opposition, very much against Iranian government intervention in their domestic affairs, and using Iraq as a proxy ground for its conflicts with the United States and other powers. So this is not good for Iraq. I think Saudi Arabia, mindful that some of the Shia community in the eastern provinces have been supported by Iran, although I think there's more to be said about Saudi Arabia's own abuse of its population. But nevertheless, I think they're going to be more emboldened, so we might see more activity in Saudi Arabia against the current regime. Again, all of this just, I think, suggests more instability. And lastly, with the Houthi rebels, who increasingly today, perhaps a self-fulfilled prophecy, are really now becoming more allied to Iran. And I think this is really problematic as well for the prospects of some sort of end to the Yemeni conflict, which has been disastrous for its people. The Houthis feel very much emboldened. They are winning on the ground. That is the reality. And I think this is something that if the next president and supreme leader eventually wants to sort of double down on the sort of Islamic nature of the republic, I think they are going to want to also double down on this idea of it being a potential model for other Muslim states across the region. So I only expect more intervention. I think more instability comes with that. And frankly, it's not going to be good for the people on the ground.
No, thank you for that, Basma. And let me ask you, in the last year or so, we've seen a shift in the geopolitics of the region with the advent of the Abraham Accords, the normalization of Israeli relations with some Gulf states, and the hope that it might transcend into something bigger. From your perspective, this new relationship that Israel enjoys, going beyond a status quo peace with Jordan or Egypt into a warmer peace with the UAE and others, what do you think the impact of those accords will be when you put it against what you've so wonderfully described as a hardened Iranian agenda?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I have to sort of qualify that a little bit. I don't think it's a warming of relations between the Gulf and Israelis. It really is a warming of the leaders. So certainly, I think we've seen almost a fawning over each other when it comes to the UAE regime and the Israelis. It really is quite remarkable. What that means for Iran, certainly I think part of that warming, in my humble view, is strategic. It's not necessarily all altruistic. There is, of course, a desire to have shared technology. The Israelis are by far, I think, the strongest when it comes to surveillance technology, monitoring for domestic dissent. This is something that is very much concerning for the Emirates and other Gulf countries who want to ensure that there isn't a popular uprising against them or a democratic nascent democratic movement. So certainly, I think that is going to harden it. But I'd add that this really is also about some sort of regional protection mechanism, an unofficial one at least. And certainly, the fact that you've had these F-35s, which were really valued by the Emiratis, come to them because of, I think, the green light that was given to Congress by the Israelis, particularly because of the qualitative military edge qualifications, does suggest that indeed the Emiratis are leaning on that new Abraham Accords as a way to protect the sanctity of their borders and their sovereignty. And so they do feel very much that Iran is threatening the status quo of borders, threatening that by, indeed, as I said earlier, really kind of invoking anti-regime sentiments among the predominantly Shia population inside those countries, which are sizable minorities in some cases, with exception of Bahrain, of course, which is a majority. And so that all, I think, is about, a desire to kind of prevent Iran from continuing to grow its regional influence. And lastly, I'd add for the Saudis, that is also very important too, because they're very much afraid of Iran's continued missile system that is hitting very specific installations, particularly in the oil and gas sector. This is all very damaging to the Saudi economy, to the oil economy. And again, lastly, I'd say also with the sort of harassment of the oil shipment through the Strait of Hormuz. So all of that, I think, just lends to the point that, the Abraham Accords is indeed an attempt to sort of protect these regimes in the Gulf in particular, and Iran's movement towards a more hardline conservative foreign policy is something that they're going to be increasingly aware of and afraid of.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for those views. We're going to come back to you, obviously, Vesma. But I think this is an excellent opportunity to turn to the Hudson Institute's Michael Doran, who has published prolifically on the issues of maximum pressure and nuclear negotiations. He's one of America's foremost thinkers in the strategic interests of the Middle East. So, Mike, let me turn to you with this first question. When you've heard all of what you've heard from our panelists today, we have seen during the Trump administration the imposition of a policy of maximum pressure. And we now see President Biden with an opportunity to either take advantages of what maximum pressure yielded or to carry on the Obama administration's policy, which you've written so well about in your piece for the tablet, The Realignment. Let me ask you the simple question. Did maximum pressure work?
First, let me just say, Shuv, thanks to you and to MLI for having me. It's really a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be with a group of people, none of whom take the elections in Iran seriously. It never ceases to surprise, or never. I'm continuously surprised at how people take these sham elections seriously. Even people who are seasoned followers of international politics. With respect to your specific question, the maximum pressure, in my view, did work. The Biden administration, of course, says it didn't work, but that's sort of a supreme example of chutzpah, because the very people who are staffing the Biden administration, they were also in the Obama administration, and when Trump moved toward maximum pressure, they did everything they could to fight it, said it would never work, and they counseled the Iranians publicly, hold out, don't react too strongly, because we're going to come back into power and we're going to get rid of maximum pressure. So they did everything they possibly could to make sure that maximum pressure didn't work, including giving the Iranians encouragement to hold out against it. Now, maximum pressure, as it came to be understood, in its fullest in its fullest form was only in place for about 18 months. So what we really have to ask ourselves, not did they succeed in doing everything they wanted in 18 months, but what would have happened if we had another 4 years on top of that 18 months? And within 18 months, they basically shut down the Iranian economy, all but shut down the Iranian economy, certainly shut down the vast majority of the oil and exports, which is and really quite a feat. And it was something that, of course, the supporters of engagement of Iran, of what I'm calling the realignment, the Obama policy, said was not possible to do because it would alienate allies and so on and so forth. And even the Chinese respected the American sanctions with regard to the energy sector in Iran. They didn't respect them 100%, but to a very significant extent they did, and they didn't sign their new understanding with the regime until after the elections, and the Chinese didn't really start importing Iranian oil extensively until after the elections. So I think that's kind of the proof of just how effective those sanctions were. The administration, you mentioned the realignment. The Biden administration is dedicated, in my view, to finishing what Obama started. That's not just attacking the JCPOA or pursuing the JCPOA. That's also seeking a regional accommodation with Iran. The administration very much wants to come to a strategic understanding with Iran in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and it is putting pressure on American allies, especially Saudi Arabia and Israel, to curtail their activities in those areas, so that we can come to an accommodation with Tehran. The about face that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia made recently in a well-publicized interview on Saudi television, where he talked about how eager he was to cut a deal with Iran and how much he was concerned with helping Iran to succeed and so forth. That's a direct response to the pressure from the Biden administration to make nice with Iran. In my view, this is a very unfortunate policy. The other speakers here today have very eloquently explained why this regime has a very narrow base of support in Iran. I think all of the experts tell us, I think all of the serious experts tell us, that the regime's support inside Iran now is thinner than it has ever been before. And for us, for the United States at this moment, to turn and funnel basically hundreds of billions of dollars into the coffers of the regime makes no sense. It makes no sense strategically with respect to the just sort of the hard geostrategic interests of the United States in the Middle East, and it makes no sense morally with regard to the human rights and the cause of human rights and democracy in Iran.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Mike, for an excellent perspective on how American politics and engagement in the region have evolved. Let me ask you this question, because I think it's a burning one that I have. On one side, you have proponents saying that the people-led revolution, peaceful one on the streets of Iran, have the opportunity to replace the regime. I would say that regime change is a very difficult objective in any circumstance, and with a regime as entrenched as the one in Iran, there's very little way to imagine it would be anything but bloody, based on their own experiments in Syria and elsewhere. Meanwhile, on the other side, you see President Biden looking to assert this concept of strategic stability in his summitry in Geneva with Vladimir Putin. He has been able to arrive at some broad consensus for the West through his economic and security summits in the G7 and NATO that China poses a challenge. Russia and China have unique relationships with Iran, and this new regime, as it evolves its posture, poses a different kind of threat. From a hard realist perspective, what is your advice to Western capitals when you look at the regime, the actions of Iran, and not just nuclear negotiations, but how to engage. Do you engage? Do you isolate? How would you advise capitals outside of Washington to hold a line that actually is in support and defense of the aspirations of the Iranian people responsibly?
I think that the maximum pressure campaign was really the only way to move forward. Let me just examine a couple of three different areas with respect to that. One is the nuclear file itself. The other is Iranian militia activity in the region, and then the third is its alignment with Russia and China. With regard to the nuclear program, the argument of the Biden administration is that maximum pressure made it worse. It advanced the Iran is closer to a bomb today than it was before Trump imposed maximum pressure. I think that represents a gross misreading of what the JCPOA did. The JCPOA actually provided Iran with a very clear pathway to a bomb, an internationally approved pathway to a bomb, which it dressed up as actually preventing Iran from getting a bomb. We don't have time here to go into all the details of this, but the simple thing to say is just that within about a decade, all of the restrictions, all of them on Iran's program, disappear as a result of I should qualify that, all meaningful restrictions disappear as a result of the JCPOA, and some of them disappear long before a decade. So there's just logically, there's no way to look at those so-called sunset clauses of the JCPOA and say that this prevents Iran from getting a bomb. By 2031, Iran is going to have an industrial-sized enrichment and reprocessing capability that is going to be blessed by the international community. The international community is going to treat it like it treats Belgium, and that given the history of Iran, given the fact that it is that the IAEA has never certified its nuclear program as peaceful, this doesn't make any sense at all. Now, with regard to the militias, we've seen this vast improvement over the last decade of the militia capabilities of Iran in the Middle East. I would call this the Hezbollah model, where Iran reaches into Arab countries and builds up militias, as they're doing with the Houthis in Yemen, as they're doing with a number of groups in Iraq. And they've gotten very good at it. I think the thing at which the Iranians excel the most is the Islamic Republic excels the most is this developing these militia networks. The Biden administration is looking at the violence that the regime is able to foment as a result of this model by giving precision-guided weaponry to the Houthis and to Hezbollah and so forth, and saying, well, that's also proof that that maximum pressure didn't work. But this doesn't make any sense. This is like saying, laws against criminal activity don't work because criminal activity continues. And so what we should really do is give lots of money to criminals because the alternative didn't work. It's totally illogical. We're going to build up the regime because we failed to end all of its most violent activities. It's a logic I just can't follow at all. Now we also see that in America, this argument against containment of Iranian militias on the ground is really bound up with attitudes about the Iraq War, fear that we're going to get dragged into another long, bloody, costly conflict that is going to cause a lot of misery on the ground and not clearly serve the American national interest. But I think that we've seen over the last few years that the United States, from a distance, working with its closest allies, can bring a lot of pressure to bear on those Iranian militias if it sets its mind to it. And you only need to look at what's happened in Iraq, as one of the previous speakers mentioned. the young military age Iraqi Shiite males are taking to the streets against the Iranian-dominated militias, and that's something that's happened with very little, with very little support from the United States. It's something that I think we should pay much closer attention to. It's also a human rights and democracy issue. It's another area where Iran stands, the Islamic Republic stands steadfast against the values that I think all of us hold most dear. The third area then I mentioned is that China and Russia. Just briefly, the two of them are, in my view, using Iran as a stalking horse in order to weaken the American alliance system in the region. They're very much allied with Iran. Russia is more closely allied directly on the ground, particularly in Syria, than is China. China likes to hang back and use Russia and Iran. For me, the greatest example of that is that between 2010 and 2018, Chinese investment in Iraq increased by 1,000%. And the absolute numbers are significant, and that happened at a time when the United States cannot do business in Iraq because American businesses will be targeted by Iranian backed militias, and that's a great example of them sort of working hand in glove, but from a distance. Nobody, the Americans, because they're not thinking about the geostrategic alignment, or maybe a little bit more now, but historically haven't seen the alignment between Iran and China, didn't connect the dots. And actually, we're giving China credit for coming in and helping to build Iraq, because building the Iraqi economy was an American project. So I think that's one of the kind of confusions that we have about how the Chinese are operating. But in the last few months, I think we're seeing the close security cooperation between the Iranians and the Chinese, or the security cooperation between the Iranians and the Chinese is becoming much more obvious to the eye. They're going to move closer, and the Biden policy actually makes it possible. One of the fallacies of the Biden policy, as Secretary of State Blinken said in Anchorage when he met with the Chinese foreign minister, he said China and the United States have the same interests in Iran, and I think this is completely false. The Chinese are using Iran to undermine the American order, and they get all the benefits of Iran's disruptive behavior without being held responsible for any of it. So the Biden policy allows the Russians and the Chinese to have, or allows the Iranians to have it both ways, to benefit from all of the anti-American, anti-Western interests, concerns, and objectives of the Russians and the Chinese, while also being able to have, completely unfettered economic engagement with the West. That is, if we go back to the JCPOA. But I think even if we don't go back to the JCPOA, we've already seen a lot of stealth lessening of the sanctions. So there'll be something like JCPOA light, even if we don't have the JCPOA.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you for capturing all of these very complicated geopolitics so clearly and so succinctly. That was impressive. Thanks, Mike. We have had, a huge amount of interest in this panel, but I will tell you there is a Canadian who I admire a great deal and occasionally enjoy sparring with at the University of Ottawa, one Thomas Junot, who, when he saw this panel, obviously had many thoughts. I can feel him, my friend, wanting to have a perspective on the commentary from here. And so I'm grateful that he took some time to be a bit of an informal sixth panelist, if I could call it that, just for a few minutes. So Thomas, I know you're out there in the audience. I'd love to take the moderator's privilege to call upon you to see if you could provide us a few thoughts on what you've heard so far this morning, and perhaps provide us a couple of questions. So Thomas, are you there?
Yep.
There he is.
So thank you very much, Shuv. So Shuv asked me on Monday to react to the presentation so far and to ask a couple questions to the speakers. So I'm happy to do that. So thank you, Shuv, for the offer, and thank you to the speakers for 5 great presentations so far. So what I thought I'd do, listening to the presentations, is to try to extract some of the assumptions that are underlying the analysis that we heard, and also the prescriptions in terms of what to do for the way ahead. Just for the sake of trying to focus a bit, I will not look at the regional aspect. So there was a discussion, especially with Mike's presentation just before, on the JCPOA and Iran support for militias. I prefer to focus on the theme of the panel, or the way that it's been labeled, which is how to empower the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. So I'll pull out 5 assumptions, I think, and try to test them, because to come up with good foreign policy, you need to have assumptions that are grounded in reality to have any chance of success. So assumption number 1 that was very clear in all of the presentations and in Shuv's introduction is the Islamic Republic of Iran is a danger to its people, and it is a destabilizing force in the region. On this, I think everybody agrees, with some detailed, some variation on the detail. I agree. On this one, I think we can move on. I think it's after that there's a bit more subject for discussion. Assumption number 2, and here I'm taking this from some of the presentations, but also I've read what everybody on this panel has written over the years, what others have written from a similar worldview. So I'm kind of being flexible here on where I extract these assumptions from. The second one is that the Islamic Republic of Iran is weak and illegitimate. That's largely true, but I think some people, again, with a lot of variation, exaggerate that. The Islamic Republic is vulnerable, and it knows it. I think those are 2 key points. I think it has a fairly good assessment of its vulnerability. I think it's aware of that. I don't think it lives in a bubble where it's unaware of its vulnerability. That being said, it is not on the verge of collapse, and that's not a scenario that's close. And that is an important thing to keep in mind. Assumption number 3 is, and again here, there's a lot of variation. It's the issue of the existence or not of a viable, organized democratic opposition that would be ready to step in at some point after the Islamic Republic. And here the answer is very simply no. I wish there were, but there is not. There are activists inside Iran working in incredibly difficult conditions. There are a number of groups outside of Iran, in the US in particular, in Europe. And this is where it's a bit problematic, because most of these groups, I would even say, the organized one, and here I'm specifically not referring to individual activists, really aren't, to be blunt, are not a viable democratic opposition. So this is a very problematic element to think about if we do want to have a discussion on empowering the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people after the Islamic Republic. Assumption number 4 is also a complicated one. It's how much do we trust the US to make the right choices in playing whatever role it chooses to play in trying to steer the Islamic Republic, or Iran as a society, as a polity, towards some kind of post-Islamic Republic entity or reality. And here, obviously, different people will have different views, but as much as past is not necessarily prologue, we do have to be very careful here, keeping in mind that precedent shows that the US, at the very least, cannot be fully trusted to make the right choices in terms of supporting the right people, the right democratic activists, empowering them, supporting them, at some point providing them with weapons, because in some cases, I don't think that's a good idea, but in some cases, that's a scenario that comes up. So at the very least, we need, in thinking about post-Islamic Republic scenarios, in terms of thinking about supporting the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, who are we talking about? Do we know who are we talking about? Who do we support? How do we support them? And these are easy questions to tweet about, but in practice, it's very difficult choices in the real world. Assumption 5 is that the successor to the Islamic Republic will be better, that it can't be worse, basically. than it is now. And unfortunately, I don't think that's an assumption that is verified. The idea that a successor to the Islamic Republic will be democratic and pro-Western is by no means guaranteed at all. It might be democratic but not pro-Western but not democratic, or neither democratic nor pro-Western. Because if I think about a scenario where the regime of the Islamic Republic falls, I don't think that's going to happen in the near term, but either I'm wrong, which is entirely possible, or it happens 5 years from now or something like that. I think about an IRGC takeover, which is not better for the Iranian people and arguably also not better for the region as a whole. Assumption 6, and I'll stop on this one, is the issue of timelines. And here there is a huge variety, but when we're talking about empowering the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, what are the timelines that we're talking about? And here, as much as I absolutely understand the haste, timelines have to be in the long term. Transforming a regime, supporting change of the extent that we're referring to here takes time. It would be nice if it happened more quickly, but in reality, that is very unlikely. So I'll stop here with a couple questions. The panel is moving ahead with time, so I don't know if Shuv, you want the panelists to answer this question, but for me, even if we don't answer it now, what I hope that as people who study Iran, activists, think tanks, the media too, which obviously has a huge role to play, is to think more clearly in a way that is more grounded in reality as to, and I'll quote Shuv at the beginning, how to empower democratic voices. Kaveh is really the only panelist who made concrete recommendations in terms of how to actually do that in a way that is realistic, that is feasible on the ground, and that can lead to some kind of change. So, it's easy to tweet about these things, it's easy to write about these things, but to really suggest options that can actually have a chance of success, it's complicated. And there's no easy solution at that level. It has to be long-term. It has to come from the ground up. It has to focus on supporting Iranian voices inside Iran. Exiled activists, yes, they have to be part of the solution, but we have to be very careful as Western governments which ones we deal with. Some of them we should not, some of them we should, but there's a very difficult and important screening exercise that has to be done here that has not been done seriously so far. So my question, looking ahead, I don't know if we have time to answer that now, is to really encourage people to think more concretely, more realistically about how to empower democratic voices, because I find that has been really missing in the discussion so far in ways that are concrete. I'll stop here and thank you, Shuv.
Well, thank you, Professor Janot. A masterful contribution to this dialogue. I know that we are 30 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to some audience questions. So I'll take up some of the assumptions that Thomas has presented here. And I take his point. The assumptions we make sometimes sit in different realities. And I think that for Ottawa, for Washington, for capitals around the world, trying to understand how to advance their interests in the face of this regime, these assumptions are critical. So let me first begin with Miriam to respond to the idea of the Iranian opposition. You spent a long time working with them. You are quite familiar with their internal strengths, their resilience. You've written frequently about it. Why don't we start with you, Miriam, in your perspective when it comes to the strength of the opposition in the street?
Yeah, well, Thomas Juneau says that the democratic opposition is not viable, but he doesn't say why. So he has encouraged us to think more and to be more rigorous in our arguments. So I have to push back and say he should be more analytical and specific about exactly why an opposition to this regime as it exists already is not viable. The Iranian people have shown in many ways that they are more conscious, more organized, more capable of taking on a very brutal regime than ever before. And he also says that other than Kaveh, no one has offered practical solutions. But I have been writing for a long time with practical solutions about how the United States and other countries in the free world can and should support democratic actors' aspirations on the ground in Iran. But more importantly, what I've done and many other people have done is support those people in concrete ways. So, for example, about 10 years ago, I founded an organization, the project called Havana, which now reaches millions of people inside the country with civic education and civil society capacity building, training opportunities, dialogue opportunities, a ton of ebooks, translations, and it's a household brand throughout the country because the democratic opposition is something that is very real. The democratic opposition to the regime is the people of Iran, and what they've done and said and hoped for is very demonstrable. Anyone who has been looking can see with the slogans on the streets, with the kind of online organizing, with the kind of demonstrations and open letters. Dissidents inside the country very courageously, including people who are still in prison, wrote an open letter to President Biden asking him not to lift sanctions on the Islamic Republic, and presented concrete ways that the United States and other countries in the international community should support their democratic aspirations. But the problem is that as part of this realignment that Michael Doran speaks about, the Biden administration has very willfully, like the Obama administration did with the Green Movement, turned its back on those people, those dissidents, those aspirations. I would argue that scholars like Thomas Juneau echo that. So I would encourage him to be more rigorous about understanding what those people are already doing and saying, and what people like us have been writing about in terms of what the US government can do to support them. And again, very specific, concrete projects like Havana that have for years now echoed their aspirations and provided education and other empowerment tools to them.
Thank you very much. Basma, Miriam, for your perspective there. Let me ask Basma Momani, do you trust the United States to make the right decisions when it comes to Iran?
Oh gosh, no. I only trust the Iranian people. I mean, I think that's a given. I mean, sorry, but you know, the American footprint in the region is not very positive. I mean, anyone who, and I think even Iranians who despise the regime, and I would agree with everything that everyone said in terms of, I think the vast majority of Iranians do not want this regime. It frankly hasn't lived up to providing, whether it's development or even just the social aspirations, the political aspirations. I mean, it's underperformed on every metric in my humble view. But the million-dollar question, I think, as Thomas noted, was how do you get change? And I don't think externally induced changes in the region coming from the Americans, and with that invariably, and particularly in this context and scenario, it will include the Israelis, is not the way forward. It will actually delegitimize, I think, a very not just prominent, as Miriam noted, but authentic, opposition to the regime. But the question is how, right, and where. I think support for civil society is absolutely warranted. The more we can do to put pressure on the regime, the more we can do from the outside to support civil society voices, to promote civic education, all of that are the sort of building blocks of democracy is fantastic. The real million-dollar question is, well, is that enough to get change? And as this election shows, it's not, right? Because even the so-called reformists, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, they showed their true cards as being also very repressive, as we saw with the protesters very recently. So my point is that I think we're all, in alignment on the view that the Iranian people deserve better and the current regime is inadequate. But how? And how do you do it so that it has longevity, that it has legitimacy, and doesn't end up like, sorry, but Iraq today, which is an absolute mess. And that's really the hard part. And again, we have enormous experts on this panel of academics and former civil society actors and so forth. And I don't think we have a neat answer, because frankly, history doesn't have a neat answer on how to do this. But one thing I can say we do know is how not to do this, and how not to do this is to think some sort of externally motivated regime change, top down, is the way to go.
Ali Reza, the regime, is it strong or is it weak?
So I think Dr. Juno made a bunch of false assumptions. The IRGC already controls Iran. So if the regime goes, IRGC goes with it. It's not a matter of the IRGC being the next regime in Iran. It has very firm control. And of course, the regime is vulnerable. I mean, it's faced two massive revolts. The economy has been on the verge of collapse. Even the regime knows this. I mean, Khamenei, Raisi, people like that have been talking about revolts for some time and preparing for it. So the regime being vulnerable is not an assumption whatsoever. Is it on the verge of collapse? I don't think anybody in this group made that claim, like Dr. Juno said. I mean, nobody's claiming that it's on the verge of collapse. But is it vulnerable? Yes, I think any regime that is that extremely unpopular has completely mismanaged the country, is hated across the region, it's hated across the world, and it's hanging on to a very highly flawed non-proliferation agreement is vulnerable, definitely. Is there a organized, viable opposition to the regime? Definitely there is. And I know actually dozens of Iranians everywhere, just in the past few years, who become very active and organized. There's a very, very active effort in Washington, D.C. To shape U.S. government policy. There are demonstrations inside the United States and elsewhere on a very regular basis. And if Dr. Juno actually just watched the opposition conference, it was in Persian. I don't know if he speaks Persian, but if you watch the opposition conference that was broadcast on Iran International and BBC Persian, I think he might get some of the nuance on what's happening. Unfortunately, I think the regime's lobby in DC and Ottawa has really shaped the narrative about a lot of these topics. And so, it's shaped the thinking of a lot of academics who've come to have a very narrow view of what's happening in Iran and with the Iranian opposition. There's really very few instances in history I can think of where just a totalitarian regime falls and an organized opposition is ready to come and take place, especially when that regime kills members of the opposition within and outside the country. It never really works that neatly, but I can tell you that Iranians outside and inside Iran are some of the most highly educated and capable of people. And there are millions of them ready to go back into Iran and rebuild Iran after this regime. And I think that is the viable opposition. Not some standards outsiders come up with to judge the opposition. I think the best thing the United States can do is not to go ahead with the JCPOA, because that will produce billions of dollars for Raisi and Khamenei to continue the brutal oppression of the Iranian people. Nobody's asking for the U.S. to engineer a coup in Iran. I think the Iranian people have the capability of affecting change in Iran. But if the Biden administration goes ahead with JCPOA, it'll just empower this regime. And I think the best thing the Biden administration can do is not to empower this regime, not to turn a blind eye to the struggle of the Iranian people, and not to dismiss crimes against humanity within Iran and minimize them. Some of the things democracy activists have seen from the Biden administration are deeply, deeply disappointing. And this argument that, well, the Iranian people are not ready for democracy, there's no viable opposition, so we'll just deal with the regime and give it billions of dollars, I think is very disingenuous. Thank you.
No, thank you. Listen, I take Professor Juno's stress test of the strength of the regime with authenticity when it comes to the face of the strength of the Iranian people to replace it. As you know, there is a really difficult discussion to be had about exactly how transitions work in a post-regime environment, and not all of them are quite, bloodless. It's a complex question, but I really thank you for your intervention, because I do think you've done a wonderful job at describing the strength of the Iranian people. And Kaveh, maybe I could turn to you right now as well, because you did mention some specific things that can be done from outside the regime to hold it to better account. Miriam and Besma have done a good discussion around how the civil society of Iran can be supported. What do you think will be the kind of timelines that are involved here? And on this, I'd like to draw in an audience question that we've been provided, which is that Iran is a huge young population, teeming with what Ali Reza described as cosmopolitan, modern, very, if we can call it progressive, certainly in the Iranian context, in its outlook about peace and stability in the region of the world. So when you think about the timelines of the next 5 to 10 years, Kaveh, what do you think this youth bulge will mean for the regime, for its heirs, and for how the West should position itself to partner with them?
Sure, that's a very good question. And I actually want to echo what you said, Shuv. I actually appreciate Dr. Junot coming in with the intervention that he did. It is good to stress test these assumptions and ideas. I think in the opposition, sometimes there's a tendency to kind of get a little bit farther away from reality. And it's good to have people of good faith. And I actually do take Dr. Junot as somebody of good faith to challenge those assumptions. So I think with respect to the timelines and the population, I think it is going to make the life of the Islamic Republic tougher, and it makes the Islamic Republic more vulnerable. And I think this goes to kind of the assumption that Dr. Junot wanted to stress test about how vulnerable or weak is the Islamic Republic. I think it's quite weak. It's weak simply because it's got a population that is very well connected with the outside world, that understands freedom. It's not sort of cut off like the North Koreans, for example. It's a population that's very engaged with the world. There's a large diaspora that they're regularly in contact with. They understand what freedom looks like and they want it. But the regime is not prepared to deliver that for them. It simply cannot. It's just, structurally, it can't do that. And that's, I think, what points to the weakness of the regime. It's the reason why the regime will not have, anything resembling free elections. Even the relative freedom of past elections, which were not free, it won't replicate because it is weak and it is afraid. It's why it shoots protesters in large numbers on the streets, because it's worried that unless it absolutely crushes these acts of dissent, it will get out of control. And I think that problem is only going to get worse as more young people come into the workforce and there's no jobs for them. The Iranian regime is poor. It is desperate. It has very few allies in the region or internationally. And so it sees its own collapse. And I think it's decided that, the reform project has failed. And so what it needs to do is it needs to clamp down harder. So I think, the timeline, I think much of it will depend on kind of how the JCPOA is handled. If there is a deal and lots of money goes to Iran, then I think the regime gets a lifeline. If a policy of pressure and maximum support for civil society exists, then I think, that the regime, we might see its collapse sooner. If I may add one other thing, Shub, and I'm mindful of the time, but Dr. Junot made also asked a very good question about whether or not the successor to this regime, if there is one, it will be any better. And is it a safe assumption that, Iran will become a democratic state? There is obviously no guarantees, but I think there are a couple of data points that we can look at that would tell you that Iran might be more likely to make a good democratic transition than some other countries. You've seen Iraq, you've seen the Soviet Union, you've seen these countries that have gone through these changes. I don't think any of them, in the past 50 years where we've seen some transitions, any of them have had the strength of civil society and the desire, the outwardly expressed desire of the population to have that regime gone and to have a democratic system in place. The population wants democracy, but I think it's really critical, if we think about the post-Islamic Republic world, that we can't make the mistakes, as Dr. Mamani mentioned. We can't have it play out like Iraq, right? I think a mistake would be to say, we're rid of the Islamic Republic, let's get rid of anyone that did anything that worked with the Islamic Republic. I think that would be a mistake. I think there is obviously, there are people that have collaborated with this regime that have blood on their hands, that cannot be part of the future of the Islamic Republic. But there are technocrats, there are people that work within the system that have to be utilized. Like, there has to be some national reconciliation after the fact. And I think then we can kind of draw on the strengths of people inside the country and outside the country. And I think in that case, the successor regime will be a success.
Yeah, thank you, Kaveh. So, Mike Duran, we are at that inflection point yet again between the domestic pressures between the Iranian regime and its people, and then the geopolitics of its backers. And I wanted to pick up a little bit on this network that you've written and described here today about Russia and China and Iran collaborating geopolitically and through various means. What's your takeaway from the resilience of the regime and how to deal with a more radicalized version of it in terms of our immediate next steps? The election, the selection, the sham election is about to happen. A new leadership will be installed. The regime is very clear about the direction in which it's going and the partnerships it chooses to deepen. What do we do now?
Thanks. I can really only echo the comments of my colleagues here. A lot of the assumptions of Professor Junot, I actually agree with. I think that he thinks they lead to a conclusion. He suggests, I think he didn't actually say what conclusions he draws, that I wouldn't personally draw. I do not know how resilient the regime is. It clearly has a fair amount of resilience. But we can see all of the obvious weaknesses that our colleagues here have pointed out. For me, as an American, advising on American policy, it just really comes down to a very simple question. Should the United States be helping to build up this regime or not? And that's what it comes down to. And for me, there's no benefit to the United States or to the Iranian people of the policy of the United States of normalizing with Iran and seeking a strategic accommodation with it. I don't see any benefit. We're not going to get a kinder, gentler Iranian regime. I mean, there's an assumption that one of the key assumptions that Professor Junot did not address is this regime in its external behavior inherently aggressive, expansionist, and hostile to the American order, or is it a defensive power that's seeking some kind of accommodation with the West? For me, those are the key assumptions that we need to examine. My own view is very decidedly, categorically, that this is an expansionist regime, that it's hostile to the American order, and that it imagines a future in which it is the dominant player, certainly in the Persian Gulf, if not in the entire Middle East. And it imagines, as it repeatedly says, a Middle East that's really without the United States in it. There is a kind of contradiction here in that the regime is weak in all the ways that our colleagues here have described, and yet it still has these grand ambitions. And it can only achieve those grand ambitions by turning the United States into its partner. And unfortunately, a significant number of national security experts in Washington are quite willing to become the partner, the unannounced partner of the regime. And to me, that's just silly. Now, it's silly, it's self-defeating. Now, there's a lot of issues we don't know about the future. Will there be a transition to a democratic government rather than a more repressive one? Will there be lots of disruption and so on? Nobody has any answers to these questions. We can only do the best we can do. But why would we want to build up this horrendous regime, which is bad for its own people, bad for the region, bad for the West? That's beyond me.
I thank you very much, Mike. We're now in the final chapter here where we've got 5 minutes left and 5 panelists to go through. So the basic math means 1 minute a person. And so I'll start with Miriam for 1 minute of concluding thoughts, but let me frame it really quickly for the Canadian people and the Canadian interest. What is your best advice for what Canada should do in the near term in support of the Iranian people and in support of peace and stability in the region? Miriam.
You're on.
So sorry. Thank you, Shuv. I think the Canadian government and other democratic governments around the world need to understand, as Mike Doran has said, that there are two reasons are on both counts, strategically and morally. The free world has absolutely nothing to gain from empowering a repressive regime that isn't just a danger to its own people, but is intent on destabilizing and keeping destabilized the Middle East region, and is an existential enemy of the United States and all liberal democracies. I think there's something disingenuous about the approach that the Biden-Obama team has taken with regards to Iran. It's disingenuous because they also know that a regime like this is not reformable, and a regime like this will never not be an enemy to Israel and the United States. And yet they will feign some kind of opposition to voices like ours that are really an echo or an amplifier of the Iranian peoples, and say that what we're saying is not true or it's not important. And I think in their hearts, they know that it's true, just like it's true for all the other countries in the world that have made successful democratic transitions. We have a tendency to focus on the examples like Iraq or the Soviet Union or the countries that didn't make it. But the thing is, there are lots of democracies in the world today that weren't democracies 20, 30, 40 years ago. We need to take the lessons from those countries and apply them to Iran. The fact that Iran is geographically in the Middle East doesn't mean that it can't learn from Chile, or that it can't learn from other countries in the Far East that are democracies today, or other countries in Eastern Europe that are democracies today. There's absolutely no reason. And when Iran is a democracy, what we will see is that it's not just the Iranian people that live dignified lives. We'll see that people throughout the Middle East region will have a real chance at freedom and peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Wonderful. You're well over 1 minute and totally out of order, but I appreciated it. So thank you. Ali Reza, 1 minute.
My advice to the Canadian government would be to put pressure on the Islamic Republic. There's no hope that this regime will reform. There's no point in Canada thinking that it can reestablish diplomatic relations with this regime or invest money in Iran after the JCPOA. Therefore, I think the best pressure is a pressure policy. Best policy is one of pressure. That includes designating the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization, investigating the regime's networks and lobbies in Canada that are laundering billions of dollars into Canada and harassing dissidents in Canada as well, and ultimately decide with the Iranian people. I think the policy of appeasement that the Biden administration is pursuing by re-entering JCPOA is not going to work in the long term, and the writing is on the wall. Not only because I don't think this regime is viable, I don't think the agreement is viable in the long term, given Republican opposition to it in DC and really widespread hatred for this regime in America. I think the best policy that countries like US and Canada can pursue is to support the Iranian people. And there are many ways of doing that. We've written a lot about it, and we'll continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well said. The long term, people will remember where Canada stands. Vesma, 1 minute.
Yeah, I would say invest in the Iranian people in any way we can find a way to do so. Look, the Iranian people are highly educated. They're brilliant. And frankly, I have so much faith in them, truly and utterly. And I look at, for example, our international students, and we need to find more opportunities for the international students coming from Iran who are really spectacular. That, of course, means engagement with students and with, I think, trying to strengthen the diaspora community here as an effective voice of opposition. I would say isolate and pressure the regime. I agree with that. We do need to. And frankly, particularly now that we're pretty much sure that Raisi is going to win, I would have said the opposite under Rouhani. Not because I think there's any love for Rouhani, but because it would have been a positive demonstration effect to hopefully parts of the inner part of the regime to sort of relax things towards some sort of opening. But I'm now of the firm believer that that's just not going to happen. And we're looking at 10 years minimum of probably even longer, a conservative rule, which is also to point out that it's going to be far more repressive. I think we're going to see this because indeed the median age is 30. People want change. They want a liberalized country. And what they're going to get from the regime is the total opposite. So expect, I think, more protests and repression. And lastly, just reduce harms on the average Iranian person. I think all of our policies need to be checked and double checked and ensure that we're not harming the people we're trying to help. And that, frankly, is one of the biggest things that I had, or I would say criticism I had of some of the sanctions that we've had in place. Really, if the average Iranian is suffering, it's not good enough. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Vesma. Kaveh, 1 minute.
I will keep it very short. So first of all, I alluded to this earlier. We need a shift in mindset in Ottawa and DC, elsewhere. The old rhetoric about empowering reformists and going against conservatives, that rhetoric needs to die because it is old and it's ineffective and it's false. We need to do all the things that the previous panelists mentioned. We need a policy of pressuring the regime, but expressing solidarity with the people, much like the solidarity campaign, aimed at Poland and other places. We need a similar policy, and I absolutely 150% want to echo what Dr. Momani just said. If you are going to put pressure, you got to keep in mind that the Iranian regime is like the hostage taker. You don't want to harm the hostage along with the hostage taker. We have to make sure that we're not hitting the wrong target. So our sanctions have to be much more carefully calibrated. I'll leave it to that.
Perfectly put, Kaveh. Thank you very much. The final word goes to Michael Duran.
Thanks. I don't have a lot to add. I'll just say let's end appeasement and move back to a policy of pressure. And let's realize that this regime is very good at looking like it's something that it isn't. At base, it's a mafia regime which engages in mafia tactics. That's with regard to everything. It is a hostage taker. It is running a kind of protection racket in the region. It can't build anything. It can't build anything in Iraq. Instead, it just uses militias to hold the regime in Iraq hostage. Even the nuclear program is really just a giant protection racket. Just a scheme for extorting money out of the West. Playing that game is not going to get us. It's not going to get us anything. They'll always the regime will pocket any concession that we make, and then turn around and demand more in one form or another. And I think we should have learned that lesson a long time ago. Thank you.
I just want to thank each and every one of you, Mariam Imr-Sadeghi, Ali Reza Nader, Vesma Momani, Kaveh Shahrouz, Mike Duran, for a really compelling conversation about the realities of Iran. I'd like to thank Thomas Junot for taking a moment to challenge assumptions, challenge them in ways that I think enriched our debate and our dialogue. That's what we do at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute as we contemplate a menu set for what Canada can do to respond to contemporary threats. And I think if you summarize the last minute interventions of everybody here, you have the beginnings of what a true policy in the Canadian interest would look like when it comes to contending with the aftermath of these so-called Iranian elections. Let me take a minute to thank Alison Kerrigan, Jacqueline Beacom, and Brett Byers-Lane, colleagues of mine at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute who helped produce this event today. They are the people that make things happen, and we are all deeply indebted to them. Let me also take an opportunity to remind the audience that the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is an independent think tank. based here in Ottawa, informing the nation's debate. We benefit from independent support and donations and contributions from viewers like you. So if you thought today's last hour and a half was as enriching and interesting as I do, then buy Brett, Allison, and Jacqueline a cup of coffee by going to Macdonald-Laurier.ca. Follow us online on Twitter at ML Institute and Macdonald-Laurier.ca. Sign up to stay in touch. We look forward to hearing from you. And finally, we're experimenting today. A couple of us, Miriam and I, are going to carry on this discussion in the virtual equivalent of a cocktail party or coffee discussion following a formal panel on Clubhouse. So please go online. You'll find the location for that informal opportunity to have a chance to talk to at least a few of us today, but I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue. I'm Shuvaloy Majumdar for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, with gratitude to you all. Thank you very, very much. Be safe, stay good, see you soon.